Before this story begins, subscribe right now, because tonight's story proves that having power over the world means nothing when you can't win the heart of the one person you truly love. The Duke had kingdoms at his feet, endless wealth, and everyone begging for his attention, except the one woman who refused to be impressed by any of it. And the harder he tried to possess her, the more impossible she became to reach. If you love emotional royal romances filled with obsession, heartbreak, dangerous desire, and unforgettable twists, hit subscribe now, because this story is about to reveal what happens when the most powerful man in the kingdom meets the only woman he cannot control. The heavy silver-gilt mirror in the grand dressing room of Stirling Manor did not lie, but it withheld the only truth that mattered. It reflected a man clothed in midnight blue velvet, the heavy gold chain of the High Chancellor draped across broad shoulders, and a chest adorned with medals won in campaigns that had reshaped the borders of the empire. At 34, his hair was a dark, unruly wave that defied the rigid etiquette of the court, and his eyes, a sharp, piercing hazel, were accustomed to men lowering their gaze in submission. He was a man who commanded legions, whose single signature on a parchment could ruin noble houses or elevate beggars to lords. Yet as he stared at his own reflection, a hollow, echoing silence filled the cavernous room. Hello my wonderful viewers, and a truly warm welcome back to the channel. It is absolutely incredible to have you here with me today. Before we dive deep into the heart of this gripping, emotional tale, I want to take a moment to say hello to each and every one of you. Whether you are tuning in from the bustling streets of New York, the quiet countryside of England, the vibrant cities of Australia, or anywhere else across the globe, please let me know in the comments below exactly where you are watching from tonight. How are you all doing? I truly hope life is treating you with kindness. If you find yourself swept away by the raw emotion and suspense of today's story, please take a quick second to check if you have subscribed to the channel. If you haven't yet, implore you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. Your incredible support is the lifeblood of this channel, and it allows me to keep bringing these intense, unforgettable narratives to life just for you. Now let us return to a world where absolute power cloaks an absolute emptiness. The velvet of his doublet felt suffocating, a heavy armor designed to keep the world at bay. Outside the towering arched windows, the capital city of Oakhaven lay bathed in the amber glow of a setting sun, its spires and crowded thoroughfares humming with the name of the man who ruled them in all but name. To the aristocracy he was an impenetrable fortress, a ruthless strategist who played the game of politics with a cold, mathematical precision. To the common folk he was a myth wrapped in silk and steel. But inside the quiet sanctuary of his private chambers, the myth was bleeding. His fingers, laced with rings of sapphire and signet gold, clenched tightly against the edge of the mahogany vanity. The source of his torment lay not in the stacks of intelligence reports detailing unrest on the southern border, nor in the subtle, poisonous whispers of rival factions vying for the crown's favor. It lay in a simple, unadorned piece of cream-colored linen sitting on his desk, bearing a brief, politely distant note written in a precise, elegant script. She was leaving the capital. She was returning to the quiet, fog-shrouded coastal village of her birth, entirely untouched by the grandeur he had laid out before her feet like a desperate tribute. Every woman in the high society of the empire would have sacrificed their family's honor for a single glance from him. They paraded before him in gowns woven from silver thread, their laughter practiced, their eyes reflecting not him, but the vast, glittering expanse of his wealth and titles. They wanted the Duke. They wanted the security of his shadow, the prestige of his name, and the absolute immunity his favor provided. But she looked past the velvet, past the gold chain of office, past the terrifying aura of authority that made even the emperor speak with caution in his presence. When her gray eyes met his, she saw only a man locked inside a gilded cage of his own making, and she refused to be another trophy hung upon its bars. The memory of their encounter the previous evening burned in his chest like an unquenched ember. He had cornered her in the conservatory of the Winter Palace, away from the suffocating heat and false smiles of the royal gala. The air had been thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth, a striking contrast to the perfume-laden ballroom they had left behind. He had offered her the deed to the whispering estates of Rosebriar, a property of such breathtaking beauty and immense value that it had caused wars between earls in the previous century. He had presented it not as a bribe, but in his own flawed, arrogant mind as a manifestation of his regard. He had expected the flash of avarice, the sudden widening of eyes, the standard yielding that followed every display of his overwhelming power. Instead, she had merely looked down at the parchment, her expression a calm, unreadable pool before lifting her gaze to meet his. There was no fear in her eyes, no breathless gratitude. There was only a profound, devastating pity that cut through his defenses more cleanly than any assassin's blade ever could. "You give me land, your grace, because you do not know how to give of yourself," she had said, her voice a quiet, steady melody that silenced the distant echo of the palace orchestra. "You seek to buy a heart so you do not have to risk breaking your own. I have no use for Rosebriar. And I have no use for a man who hides behind an empire." The words had struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him speechless as she offered a flawless, respectful curtsy and walked away, her simple sage-green gown flowing behind her like a reprimand. Now standing alone in his dressing room, the full weight of his isolation crashed down upon him. He had the world at his feet, every desire fulfilled with a whispered command, every whim satisfied by a small army of eager servants. Yet the only soul whose validation could bring warmth to his cold reality was slipping through his fingers, entirely immune to the tools he had spent a lifetime mastering. Suddenly, a sharp, frantic knocking shattered the silence of the room. The heavy oak door burst open, breaking the rigid protocol of the ducal household. His trusted captain of the guard stood on the threshold, chest heaving, his face drained of all color, holding a shattered seal that bore the crest of the royal crest. The captain's voice trembled, breaking the heavy stillness with words that turned the duke's blood to ice. "Your Grace. The carriage carrying her to the northern coast. It never arrived at the first outpost. We found the escort slaughtered on the high road. He's gone, my lord. And left in the dust was this." The captain held up a single blood-stained ribbon, the very same sage-green ribbon she had used to bind her hair the night before. The world seemed to stop spinning. The absolute power that had defined his entire existence vanished in an instant, leaving behind nothing but raw, bleeding vulnerability. Who had taken her? Was it a strike by his political enemies to bring him to his knees, or a darker, more personal vengeance? As the realization of her mortal danger gripped his heart, a terrifying question echoed through the empty chambers of his soul. If all his wealth, his armies, and his terrifying influence could not save the only woman he truly desired, what was the worth of being a king in all but name? The blood-stained ribbon felt unnaturally light in his palm, yet it possessed a weight that threatened to crush the breath from his lungs. Christian Sterling, the Duke of Oakhaven, a man whose ancestral line had dictated the rise and fall of dynasties, stared at the silk. For years, Christian's life had been a masterclass in emotional detachment. Raised by a calculating father who taught him that dependency was a fatal flaw, Christian had constructed an internal fortress. His deepest motivation was control. His greatest fear was the chaos of betrayal. He had watched his mother die heartbroken by his father's coldness, a trauma that convinced a young Christian that emotions were vulnerabilities to be eradicated. He had lived by a singular, rigid creed: if you own everything, nothing can hurt you. Yet as he looked at the violent crimson stain marring the quiet sage-green fabric, that creed shattered. He did not own her. He could not protect her. The realization tore at the carefully woven fabric of his arrogance, exposing a raw, terrified man beneath the ducal facade. "Assemble the first regiment," Christian commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp that made the window panes vibrate. "Seal the city gates. No one leaves the capital without my personal seal." "Your Grace," Captain Ethan Thorne replied, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce loyalty. Ethan had served with Christian in the mud and blood of the trenches during the Great Siege of the Western Marches. He knew the Duke better than anyone alive, having witnessed the man's tactical brilliance and his capacity for absolute ruthlessness. But Ethan had never seen this expression on his master's face. A look of unadulterated, desperate panic. "The King's Council is already meeting to discuss the unrest in the south. If you deploy the Royal Regiment for a personal matter, the faction led by Lord Vance will accuse you of treason. They will claim you are using the Crown's resources to secure your own interests." "Let them talk," Christian snarled, stepping past the captain into the main corridor, his boots striking the polished marble like thunderclaps. "If Lord Vance speaks a single word against this house, I will remind him who pays the wages of his private guard. Go, Ethan. Now." As Ethan rushed to fulfill the commands, Christian strode into his private library, a sanctuary of ancient texts and shadow where he often retreated to plan his political maneuvers. Waiting for him there, sitting quietly near the hearth with a cup of unsteamed tea, was Clara Vance. Clara was the daughter of his chief political rival, yet she was also one of the few people Christian tolerated within his inner circle. She was sharp-witted, elegant, and possessed a mind that could untangle the most complex court intrigues. For months, the high society of Oakhaven had whispered that Clara would be the one to finally claim the Duke's hand, a union that would perfectly merge the two most powerful houses in the empire. Clara certainly desired it. She saw in Christian an intellectual equal, a man of unmatched stature, and a husband who could elevate her to the pinnacle of imperial society. But Clara's eyes shifted as Christian entered, noting the blood-stained ribbon clutched tightly in his fist. A subtle shadow passed over her otherwise flawless features, a brief tightening of her jaw that betrayed a cold, calculating resentment. "You look unsettled, Christian," Clara said smoothly, her voice like silk over a hidden blade. "It is rare to see the High Chancellor of the Empire looking so undone. Has there been a development on the southern border?" "Elena has been taken," Christian said, not wasting time with pleasantries. He stopped before the massive hearth, staring into the dying embers. He didn't see the fire, he saw Elena's face. Elena Vance, no relation to Clara's family, though her last name was a common one derived from the northern valleys, was a woman of quiet, devastating simplicity. She had come to the capital to manage the royal archives, a scholar of history who preferred the company of ancient, crumbling vellum to the superficial pageantry of the court. She possessed no titles, no vast inheritance, and no desire for political influence. While other women adorned themselves in jewels that could buy villages, Elena wore simple linen and wool, her beauty derived from her piercing, intelligent gray eyes and an aura of absolute self-possession. Christian had met her 6 months ago in the dim recesses of the Imperial Library, looking for a historical precedent regarding maritime tax laws. Instead of bowing or stammering in his presence as others did, Elena had merely pointed him to the correct shelf without looking up from her translation work. When he had demanded her full attention, using his most commanding ducal tone, she had simply raised her eyes and said, "Your Grace, the books do not care about your title and neither do I. If you want the truth of history, you must learn to read it with humility, not authority." From that moment, Christian had been utterly captivated. He was used to sycophants who anticipated his every whim. Elena was a bracing, cold wind in a room filled with suffocating incense. He began visiting the archives daily, inventing historical queries just to hear her voice. He showered her with rare manuscripts, offered her a position as his personal archivist with a salary that would make a count envious, and even commissioned a private carriage for her comfort. But Elena saw through the luxury. She saw a man trying to colonize her life, trying to make her dependent on his wealth so he could control her affection. She accepted the manuscripts only on behalf of the public archives, refused the salary, and chose to walk through the muddy streets of Oakhaven rather than ride in his gilded carriage. She demanded something Christian had never given anyone: his true self, stripped of his power. And because he was too terrified to show her that vulnerable core, she had chosen to leave. "The archivist?" Clara asked, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, drawing Christian back to the present. She set her teacup down with a sharp click against the saucer. "You have threw the city into chaos for a common librarian, Christian? Do you have any idea how this looks to the council? Your enemies are looking for any sign of weakness, any crack in your armor. To obsess over a woman who has repeatedly rejected your favors is not just unbecoming, it is dangerous." "She is not a common librarian to me," Christian said softly, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. He turned to face Clara, his hazel eyes flashing with a predatory light. "And whoever took her did not just commit a crime. They declared war on me. And what if she left of her own accord?" Clara countered, rising from her chair and stepping closer to him, her perfume filling the space between them. "What if she staged this disappearance to escape the suffocating weight of your attention? You are a powerful man, Christian, but power can be a terrifying thing to those who do not know how to wield it. Perhaps she simply wanted her freedom." The words cut deep, planting an insidious seed of doubt in Christian's mind. Could she have staged it? Did she hate his entitlement so much that she would sacrifice her escort, bloodden her own ribbon, just to vanish from his sight? The thought was a sickening twist in his gut, but as he looked down at the ribbon he knew the truth. The blood was real. The violence on the high road was real. Before he could answer, Ethan returned, his face grim. "Your Grace, we found something else at the site of the ambush." One of the attackers survived long enough to speak. He didn't give a name, but he muttered a phrase before he died. "The crown must be stripped of its anchor." Christian's heart hammered against his ribs. Its anchor. That was the term the emperor used in private to describe Christian's role in holding the fragile empire together. This wasn't a random bandit attack. This was a calculated political strike designed to break him, to distract him, or to force him into a mistake that would destroy his standing forever. Elena was a prisoner because of him, suffering for a power she had never wanted any part of. If you are leaning in close to this unfolding mystery and want to see if Christian can unravel this conspiracy, take a brief moment to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on who you think is behind the abduction. Is it an outside enemy or someone much closer to home? Don't forget to make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single chapter of this journey. Christian turned to Ethan, his eyes burning with an intense, terrifying resolve. "Get my horse. We ride to the northern high road immediately. If the council wishes to call it treason, let them. I am going to find her, even if I have to burn this entire empire to the ground to do it." The midnight air on the northern high road bit like a rusted dagger. Rain fell in relentless icy sheets, turning the dirt highway into a treacherous mire of black mud and decaying autumn leaves. Christian spurred his black stallion forward, his dark cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a predatory bird. Behind him rode Ethan and a dozen of the finest scouts from the 1st Regiment, their torches flickering violently against the torrential downpour. When they reached the clearing where the ambush had taken place, the scene was a grotesque tableau of violence. The ducal carriage Christian had secretly commissioned for Elena lay splintered on its side, one of its heavy wooden wheels spinning slowly in the wind. The bodies of the 4 guards Christian had assigned to protect her were scattered across the tall grass, their armor pierced by heavy, cross-shaped bolts. Christian dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots sinking into the mire. He ignored the mud, his eyes scanning the carnage with a desperate, clinical focus. He knelt beside the lead guard, a seasoned soldier whose throat had been cleanly slit from behind. This wasn't the work of desperate highwaymen looking for coin. The cuts were precise, the positioning tactical. "Your Grace," Ethan called out, holding a lantern over a set of deep, heavy iron ruts leading away from the road into the dense black expanse of the Blackwood forest. They used a heavy transport wagon to move her. And look at these footprints. They were wearing standard-issue military boots, but the tacks on the soles are filed down to hide the regiment insignia. Christian walked over, his chest heaving as he stared into the dark abyss of the forest. The realization hit him with the force of an avalanche. The enemy was within his own ranks. The men who had taken Elena were trained Imperial soldiers acting under the orders of someone with immense authority in Oakhaven. Suddenly, a faint rhythmic clicking sound echoed from the shadows of the carriage wreckage. Christian's hand flew to the hilt of his broadsword, his muscles tensing for a fight. "Who's there?" he demanded, stepping over a fractured door pane. From beneath a tattered leather canopy, a figure stumbled out into the lantern light. It wasn't an attacker. It was an elderly scholar, his spectacles shattered, a deep gash weeping blood across his forehead. It was Arthur Vance, the master of the Imperial Archives and Elena's mentor. He had been traveling with her to assist in her relocation. "Your Grace." Arthur gasped, collapsing into Christian's arms. Christian caught him, holding the old man up with an unexpected gentleness that surprised even Ethan. "Where is she, Arthur? Who took her?" Christian asked, his voice tight with an agonizing restraint. They knew exactly who she was," Arthur wheezed, clutching Christian's velvet doublet with bloodied fingers. "A man in a heavy iron mask. He led them." Elena tried to reason with him, but he laughed. He said her quiet independence was the perfect bait to lure the high and mighty High Chancellor out into the open. "Christian, it's a trap. They want you out of the capital. They want you broken." Before Christian could process the old man's words, a low, menacing hiss tore through the air. "What?" An iron crossbow bolt slammed into the mud inches from Christian's boot. From the tree line of the Blackwood forest, dozens of glowing torches suddenly ignited, revealing a blockade of heavily armored men. And standing at the center of the line, mounted on a gray mare and wearing a polished iron mask that caught the cold moonlight, was the leader. Christian Sterling. The masked man's voice boomed across the clearing, distorted and hollow behind the metal. The great ruler who owns everything yet possesses nothing. You have spent your life collecting lands and titles, but tonight your greatest prize belongs to us. Christian stepped forward, his sword clearing its scabbard with a sharp, lethal ring. Release her, or I will ensure your execution takes 3 days to complete. The masked man laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. He gestured behind him. 2 soldiers dragged a figure forward from the shadows of the transport wagon. It was Elena. Her hands were bound in coarse rope, her hair tangled and damp from the rain, but as the lantern light caught her face, Christian's breath caught in his throat. There was no terror in her gray eyes. Even in captivity, surrounded by weapons and cloaked in mud, she held her head high with that same quiet dignity that had first brought the Duke to his knees. She looked past her captors, her gaze locking onto Christian. "Christian, do not step into this clearing," she shouted, her voice remarkably steady despite the blade resting near her throat. "They don't want ransom. They want your downfall. If you cross that line, you lose the Empire." "Silence the girl," the masked leader barked, and a soldier struck her across the cheek with a leather gauntlet. Seeing her struck broke something fundamental within Christian. The cold, calculating strategist vanished, replaced by an ancient, primal fury. He didn't care about the king's counsel, he didn't care about Vance's accusations of treason, and he didn't care about the fragile peace of the Empire. "Kill them all," Christian roared, charging into the clearing alone, his sword raised. What followed was a blur of chaos and blood. The masked men opened fire, bolts tearing through the night. Christian parried a strike from an oncoming attacker, spinning and driving his blade through the man's breastplate. Ethan and the ducal scouts charged closely behind him, clashing with the rogue soldiers in a brutal close-quarters melee. Christian fought like a man possessed, cutting a path of destruction directly toward the transport wagon. He was entirely blind to his own safety, his hazel eyes locked onto the sage-green dress of the woman he loved. He reached the back of the wagon, parrying a downward strike from a guard and kicking him into the mud. He reached out his hand, his fingers mere inches from Elena's bound wrists. For a fraction of a second their eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, Christian didn't see a possession he needed to acquire. He saw his entire world. "Elena," he cried out. But before their hands could join, a sudden, blinding flash of light exploded between them. The masked leader had thrown an alchemical smoke bomb into the mud. A thick, acrid gray fog filled Christian's lungs, blinding his eyes and forcing him into a violent coughing fit. Through the dense smoke, he heard the sharp crack of a whip and the terrified whinny of horses. The heavy transport wagon surged forward, its iron-shod wheels tearing through the mud as it vanished deep into the impassable depths of the Blackwood forest. The smoke cleared to reveal a silent, empty clearing. The remaining attackers had scattered into the shadows. Christian fell to his knees in the mud, his sword slipping from his numb fingers. He stared at the empty tracks where the wagon had been. For the first time in his adult life, the Duke of Oakhaven was completely powerless. He had entered the battle as a tyrant trying to claim a prize, but as the rain washed the blood from his hands, he realized the terrifying truth. The trap had already sprung and Elena was paying the price for his arrogance. The return to the capital was a silent, somber march through the dying hours of the night. Christian sat atop his stallion, his face a mask of cold stone, but beneath the surface, a tempest of guilt and fury raged. He had brought Arthur back to the manor to be treated by his personal physicians, but the old scholar's warning echoed in his mind. "It's a trap. They want you broken." By morning, the Grand Library of Stirling Manor had been converted into a war room. Maps of the Blackwood Forest and the northern provinces were pinned to the heavy oak tables, weighted down by daggers and silver chalices. Christian had not slept, nor had he removed his mud-splattered armor. "The tracks vanish near the Serpent's Spine," Ethan explained, pointing a weathered finger at a mountain range bordering the dense forest. "It's an area riddled with old iron mines and smuggler tunnels. 1,000 men could hide there for months, Your Grace. If we launch a full-scale military sweep, they will hear us coming miles away and move her deeper into the mountains. Or worse, They will kill her to erase the evidence. Then we don't use 1,000 men, Christian said, his voice dangerously calm. We use a strike team. 5 men. Light armor. We move on foot through the old hunter paths. And what of the King's Council? A sharp, critical voice cut through the room. Christian turned to see Clara standing at the entrance of the library. She wore a dark crimson gown that seemed to mimic the blood he had seen on the high road, her expression an elegant mix of concern and calculating judgment. She stepped into the room, her gaze scanning the maps before settling on Christian's disheveled appearance. My father has already called an emergency session of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal, Clara said, stepping closer to the table. They know you deployed the 1st Regiment without the King's signature. Lord Vance is framing it as an attempted coup. He is claiming that the High Chancellor is mobilizing forces to seize the throne while the South is unstable. Christian let out a low, humorless laugh. Let him claim what he wishes. The throne means nothing to me if Elena is. He caught himself, swallowing the name before it could betray the full extent of his vulnerability to a political player like Clara. But Claire was too sharp. She noticed the hesitation, the sudden softening of his eyes when he spoke of the archivist. A cold, dangerous jealousy flared behind her green eyes. She had spent years positioning herself to be the Duchess of Oakhaven, mastering the etiquette, the alliances, and the bloodlines. Yet this simple woman from the provinces who spent her days covered in ink and dust, had managed to unhinge the most powerful man in the empire within months. You are losing your mind over her, Christian, Clara whispered, stepping close enough that only he could hear. She is a distraction. A pawn used by your enemies to make you act recklessly. If you abandon the capital now to chase ghosts in the mountains, my father will strip you of your titles by sunset. Your legacy will be erased. Is she truly worth everything you have built? Christian looked at Clara, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw the absolute emptiness of the world he had inhabited for so long. Clara represented everything he used to value: status, calculation, and a relationship built on mutual advancement rather than true emotion. You think my legacy is this house, Clara? These titles? Christian asked softly, stepping back from her. I used to think so too. But a house is just stone and titles are just ink on parchment. Elena showed me that a man who owns the world but has no one to share his soul with is just a ghost haunting his own palace. If losing my titles is the price for her life, then I will hand them over gladly. Clara recoiled as if struck, her face hardening into a bitter mask. Then you are a fool, your grace. And a fool cannot survive in Oakhaven. She turned on her heel and swept out of the room, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind her. Ethan, Christian barked, ignoring the departure. Prepare the men. We leave within the hour. As Ethan went to gather the scouts, Christian walked over to the desk where Elena's last note lay. He picked it up, running his thumb over the elegant, precise script. You give me land because you do not know how to give of yourself. The words cut deeper now, a self-inflicted wound. He realized that his wealth hadn't just failed to protect her, it had actively placed her in harm's way. Suddenly, a hidden panel behind the library's bookshelf creaked open. Christian's hand dropped to his dagger instantly. From the secret passage, a route known only to the architects of the manor and the ducal family, a small hooded figure slipped out. It was a young boy no older than 12, dressed in the ragged clothes of a street urchin. He was trembling, his face smudged with soot, holding a small wooden cylinder used by the Imperial Intelligence Network. Who are you and how did you find that passage? Christian demanded, stepping between the boy and the exit. Am I Lord Duke? The boy stammered, dropping to his knees. I am Pip. I work the fires in the lower kitchens of the royal palace. A man in a dark cloak gave me a silver piece to bring this to you through the old servant tunnels. He said it was a message from the Iron Mask. Christian snatched the cylinder, unscrewing the brass cap with trembling fingers. Inside was a small piece of rough parchment. Written upon it in crude block letters was a single message. The high road was just a taste, Chancellor. The girl still breathes, but her air grows thin. If you wish to see her alive, come to the old foundry at the Serpent's Spine alone at midnight. If a single soldier follows you, her throat will be slit before you cross the threshold. Let us see what the Duke is willing to sacrifice when his gold cannot buy his way out. Christian's heart hammered against his ribs. A trap within a trap. They knew he would follow the tracks. They knew he would bring his scouts. They had deliberately left a trail to split his forces and draw him into an ambush where his military might would be useless. If you are holding your breath waiting to see if Christian will survive this deadly trap, please take a quick moment to drop a comment below. Do you think he should go alone or trust Ethan and his men despite the threat? Make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the shocking revelation in the next part. Ethan entered the room, his armor clanking. The strike team is ready, Your Grace. We have the mountain gear. Christian stared at the note, his mind racing. If he brought Ethan, Elena would die. If he went alone, he was likely walking to his own execution. For a man who had spent his entire life minimizing risk, this was the ultimate gamble. He looked at the blood-stained ribbons still tied around his wrist, a constant reminder of the violence she had suffered because of his name. Cancel the strike team, Ethan, Christian said quietly, crumpling the note in his fist. What? Your Grace, why? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. The council is moving against me, Christian lied smoothly, his voice regaining that cold, imperial authority he had worn for a decade. If I leave with a military force, it will trigger the coup Vance wants. I must stay and manage the political front. You and the guards will secure the manor and protect the king. Ethan stared at his commander, sensing the lie but unable to challenge the absolute weight of the Duke's tone. As you command, Your Grace. But what of the archivist? Christian turned his face toward the window, looking out at the gathering storm clouds over the mountains. She is in the hands of fate now, Captain. And so am I. As Ethan reluctantly withdrew, Christian began stripping off his heavy velvet doublet and his gold chain of office. He replaced them with a simple dark leather jerkin and a plain wool cloak, the clothes of a common traveler. He buckled his sword to his waist, not for king or country, but for the one soul who had looked past his crown and demanded his heart. He was no longer the Duke of Oakhaven. He was a man going to fight for the woman he loved. The rain had ceased by the time Christian reached the foothills of the Serpent's Spine, replaced by a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the jagged rocks like a shroud. That old foundry loomed out of the mist, a skeletal ruin of blackened timber and rusted iron beams that had been abandoned decades ago during the border wars. It was a place where old machinery lay dying, a fitting monument to the destructive nature of ambition. Christian moved through the shadows with a predatory silence, his hand resting lightly on the pommel of his sword. His heart beat with a steady rhythmic violence against his ribs. Every tactical instinct he possessed screamed that he was walking into a slaughterhouse, but the image of Elena's gray eyes kept his boots moving forward across the slick shale. He stepped through the fractured archway of the main smelting floor. The air inside smelled of cold ash, rotted wood and wet iron. High above, the roof had collapsed, allowing the pale moonlight to cut through the fog in ghostly, fractured beams. I am here. Christian's voice rang out, stripped of its ducal majesty, sounding raw and hollow in the vast empty space. I have come alone as you demanded. Show yourself and release her. A low, scraping sound echoed from the far end of the foundry floor. From the darkness behind a massive rusted crucible, a figure stepped forward. It was the leader, still clad in the terrifying, expressionless iron mask that caught the moonlight like a dead man's coin. He wasn't holding a weapon. Instead, he held a heavy iron chain that trailed into the shadows behind him. With a brutal yank of the chain, the masked man dragged a figure forward into a beam of light. Elena fell to her knees on the stone floor, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as the iron collar around her neck tautened. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised and pale, but when she lifted her eyes and saw Christian standing there in common leather and wool, stripped of his titles and his guard, a look of profound shock and devastating sorrow crossed her features. Christian, she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Why did you come? I told you, it's a trap. They want to destroy you. Be silent, girl, the masked man sneered, giving the chain another cruel tug that made Christian's blood boil. He looked across the expanse at the Duke, his voice dripping with venomous amusement. Look at the great High Chancellor. No velvet. No gold chain. No army to hide behind. You look remarkably like an ordinary man, Sterling. It is almost disappointing. You have what you wanted, Christian said, his muscles locked, his hazel eyes burning with a lethal focus. You have me isolated, away from my guards and my power. Let her go. This war is between you and me. Oh, it is indeed, the masked man laughed, a sound that resonated with a chilling, strangely familiar cadence. But you still do not understand the game you are playing, Christian. You think this is about a common archivist? You think this is a simple political maneuver to strip you of your chancellor's seat? The leader raised his gloved hands to the side of his head. With a slow, deliberate click, he released the catches of the iron mask. He pulled the metal away, letting it drop to the stone floor with a loud, clattering ring that seemed to echo into eternity. Christian's breath caught in his throat, his entire world tilting on its axis as the fog in his mind cleared to reveal a devastating truth. The man standing before him, his face twisted in a sneer of absolute hatred, was not a foreign agent or a rogue mercenary. It was Arthur Vance, the elderly, battered scholar he had supposedly rescued on the high road just 24 hours ago. The gash on his forehead was gone, replaced by a smooth, unblemished brow. The frail, trembling old man who had wept in Christian's arms was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating mastermind. Arthur. Christian breathed, his mind struggling to process the sheer scale of the betrayal. You staged the entire ambush. Of course I did, Arthur snarled, stepping over the mask, his eyes flashing with a mad, burning intensity. Do you think a man of my intellect would spend his life cataloging the history of your wretched family without learning how to destroy it? Your father ruined my house, Christian. He stripped my family of our lands, our titles, and our name during the Great Purge, leaving us to beg for crumbs in the archives while you paraded around in your velvet and gold. Christian shook his head, his hands trembling as he looked from Arthur to Elena, who sat frozen on the floor, her face a mask of horror as she realized her beloved mentor was a monster. You used her, Christian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She trusted you. She looked up to you like a father. And that is exactly why she was the perfect tool, Arthur countered, stepping closer to Elena, his fingers twisting into her dark hair, forcing her to look up at Christian. I knew she was the only thing in this world you couldn't buy. I watched you come to the archives day after day, begging for a glance from her, trying to colonize her life with your wealth. I knew that if I took her you would abandon the capital, abandon the king, and run blindly into whatever trap I set for you. And look around you, Christian. You did exactly that. Arthur, please, Elena begged, tears finally spilling from her gray eyes, cutting paths through the soot on her cheeks. Do not do this. This isn't justice for your family. This is madness. Quiet. Arthur roared, backhanding her across the face, sending her sprawling against the cold stone. Christian charged forward, his sword clearing the scabbard with a scream of cold steel, but before he could cross half the distance, the shadows around the smelting floor came alive. Dozens of crossbowmen stepped out onto the iron catwalks above, their weapons cocked and aimed directly at Christian's chest. Christian froze, his sword held high, his chest heaving as he realized the absolute hopelessness of his position. He was surrounded, outmatched, and entirely cut off from any hope of rescue. Arthur smiled, a terrifyingly serene expression returning to his face as he stepped back toward the shadow of the crucible. You see, Christian, you lost the moment you decided to care about something other than your power. Tomorrow, Lord Vance will announce your treason to the council. They will find your body here along with the girls, and the world will believe you murdered her in a fit of mad obsession before taking your own life. Your name will be a curse in the mouth of every citizen of Oakhaven. He turned to his men on the catwalks, raising his hand. Kill him. If your heart is pounding against your ribs and you are desperate to see how Christian can survive this ultimate betrayal, please take a second to leave a comment below. Share your reactions to Arthur's shocking double identity, and ensure you are subscribed so you don't miss a single second of the darkest hour that follows. Christian didn't look at the crossbowman above. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked only at Elena. In that terrifying final second before the bolts flew, their eyes met across the ruined floor. There was no longer any distance between them, no longer any pride or titles or gold to separate their souls. In the face of absolute death, Christian looked at her with a raw, unprotected tenderness that he had hidden away his entire life. He gave her his true self, completely vulnerable, completely hers. And as Elena looked back at him through her tears, her lips parted, forming a silent word that cut through the darkness sweeter than any melody. Love. The hand dropped, but the expected volley of iron bolts did not tear through Christian's chest. Instead, a heavy, deafening clack echoed through the rafters. Arthur's face twisted in sudden confusion as he looked up at the catwalks. The crossbowmen had not fired. They stood like statues in the dim moonlight, their weapons lowered, their eyes fixed on the shadows behind the upper iron tiers. From the darkness of the high scaffolding, a lone figure stepped into the pale light. It wasn't one of Arthur's mercenaries. It was Captain Ethan Thorne, his face grim, holding a smoking flintlock pistol aimed directly at the head of the lead mercenary sniper. Behind him, dozens of elite ducal scouts emerged from the upper rafters, their longbows fully drawn, their arrows tipped with burning pitch that illuminated the entire foundry in a sudden, terrifying amber glow. "Did you truly think I would obey an order to abandon you, Your Grace?" Ethan's voice boomed down from the iron tier, filled with a fierce, unbreakable loyalty. "I know the difference between a political maneuver and a man going to save his soul. We tracked you from the moment you left the manor gates." Arthur let out a feral shriek of rage, realizing his perfect trap was collapsing around him. "Kill them! Kill them all!" he screamed to his remaining ground forces. The foundry erupted into absolute chaos. The scouts on the catwalks released their arrows, rainfalls of fire arching through the dark space and striking Arthur's mercenaries before they could reload their heavy crossbows. Screams of agony and the scent of burning wood filled the air as the old structure began to catch fire. Christian did not wait for the smoke to clear. The moment the distraction hit, he lunged forward, his broadsword swinging in a lethal arc that severed the iron chain connecting Elena's collar to Arthur's hand. The force of the blow shattered the link, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. "Elena!" Christian cried, dropping his sword for a fraction of a second to wrap his arms around her waist, pulling her up from the stone floor as a mercenary's spear thrust through the air exactly where she had been lying. He deflected a second strike with his leather-clad forearm, his muscles straining against the impact, before driving his elbow into the attacker's throat. He pulled Elena behind the massive rusted iron crucible, using the heavy metal structure as a shield against the stray bolts and arrows flying across the smelting floor. Inside the small dark sanctuary of the crucible's shadow, surrounded by the roar of flames and the clashing of steel, Christian held her close. He could feel the violent trembling of her frame, the heat of her breath against his neck, and the dampness of her tears soaking into his leather jerkin. "I am sorry," Christian whispered into her hair, his voice breaking with a raw, agonizing emotion that he could no longer contain. "I am so sorry, Elena. My pride, my wealth, my absolute arrogance brought this nightmare to your door. I wanted to own your heart because I was too terrified to let you see how broken mine was. If you die here because of me..." Elena pulled back just enough to look into his hazel eyes. The gray of her gaze was no longer distant or analytical. It was burning with an intense, fierce vulnerability that matched his own. She reached up with her bound hands, her rough fingers cupping his bruised jawline, entirely ignoring the battle raging inches from their hiding place. "Christian, look at me," she commanded softly, her voice a steady anchor in the midst of the tempest. "The man who offered me Rosebriar was a legend I had no use for. But the man standing before me right now, the man who stripped off his velvet, who risked his life and who is weeping in the dirt for me, that is the man I have been waiting for. I don't want your empire, Christian. I want you." The words were a profound, healing balm that washed away years of isolation and trauma. In the darkest hour of his existence, surrounded by death and betrayal, Christian Sterling finally found the one thing his gold could never buy: unconditional love. But the moment of salvation was brutally short-lived. A sudden, agonizing scream of tearing metal echoed through the foundry. Christian looked up just in time to see one of the massive, fire-weakened timber pillars supporting the upper roof begin to buckle. Arthur, his face contorted with a mad, suicidal malice, had used a heavy iron crowbar to shatter the base of the central support beam, intending to bring the entire burning structure down upon their heads. "If I cannot destroy your legacy, Sterling, I will ensure you are buried beneath it," Arthur roared, his voice completely unhinged as the ceiling began to collapse. A massive shower of heavy slate tiles and burning timber crashed down between the crucible and the exit, creating a roaring wall of fire that completely cut Christian and Elena off from Ethan and the scouts. The upper catwalks began to warp and twist from the intense heat, forcing Ethan's men to retreat toward the high windows to avoid being burned alive. "Your Grace, you have to get out of there," Ethan shouted through the roar of the flames, his voice fading as the smoke grew thicker. "The main support is going. The whole foundry is coming down." Christian grabbed his sword, his mind racing through tactical options, but every exit was blocked by a raging inferno or tons of fallen masonry. The air was rapidly turning into a toxic cloud of ash and alchemical smoke from the burning ruins. Elena began to cough violently, her strength failing as she leaned heavily against his chest, her eyes fluttering closed. Christian looked around the burning room, a terrifying sense of helplessness gripping his heart once more. He had found her love, he had broken through his own fortress, but now they were trapped in a blazing tomb. As a massive burning rafter crashed down inches from their feet, sending a wave of blistering heat across his face, Christian held Elena as tightly as he could, shielding her body with his own, whispering a desperate prayer into the smoke as the roof above them began to cave in. The roar of the collapsing roof was deafening, a chorus of tearing iron and fracturing timber that sounded like the death rattle of a giant. Smoke, thick and black as ink, filled Christian's lungs, blinding his eyes and stinging his throat. He crouched over Elena, his body acting as a living shield as a rain of sparks and small debris bounced off his leather cloak. Her breaths were shallow, her head resting heavily against his chest, her consciousness slipping away into the suffocating dark. "Elena, stay with me," Christian gasped, his voice a cracked whisper against the din of the flames. "Please, Elena. Open your eyes." Through the haze of smoke and the blinding glare of the fire, his tactical mind, the ruthless, calculating intellect he had used to outmaneuver kings, forced its way back through his panic. He could not fight the fire with steel and he could not buy their way out with gold. He had to use the one thing he had always relied on before he became a duke: his ability to see what others missed. He looked at the floor beneath them. The old foundry had been built on the foundations of an ancient imperial mint. Beneath the smelting floor lay the old drainage vaults, deep stone channels used to carry away the waste water from the cooling troughs. If those vaults were still intact, they would lead directly out to the mountain stream that fed the valley below. Christian looked around the base of the massive iron crucible. The stone floor here was cracked and uneven, stained with decades of soot. He shifted Elena gently, ensuring she was shielded by a fallen slab of masonry, and began desperately clearing away the debris near the crucible's base with his bare hands. The hot stone blistered his palms, but he felt no pain, only a driving, desperate urgency. There, embedded in the floor and choked with decades of ash, was a heavy iron grating. He gripped the rusted bars, his muscles straining, his veins bulging against his skin as he lifted with everything he had. The iron didn't move. It was fused to the stone by time and rust. High above, another major support beam groaned, bowing under the immense weight of the collapsing roof. They had seconds before they were buried alive. "Christian," Elena whispered, her eyes fluttering open for a brief moment, her hand weakly reaching out to touch his knee. "It's too heavy. Save yourself." "Never," Christian snarled, a fierce, unbreakable resolve igniting in his chest. He looked at his broadsword lying in the dirt. He jammed the thick, forged steel blade between the iron bars of the grating, using the pommel as a lever, and threw his entire weight against the hilt. With a sharp, metallic crack, the stone edge fractured. The grating shifted, sliding sideways to reveal a dark, narrow stone chute dropping down into the absolute blackness below. Cold, damp air rushed up through the opening, cutting through the suffocating heat of the foundry. "Ethan!" Christian roared into the smoky void above, hoping his captain could still hear him through the din, the drainage vaults. "Meet us at the base of the mountain stream." He didn't wait for a response. He gathered Elena into his arms, pulling her tightly against his chest, and stepped into the dark opening just as the central support beam of the foundry finally snapped, bringing thousands of tons of burning timber down into the space they had occupied a fraction of a second before. They slid down a steep, slick stone chute, tumbling through the darkness before crashing into a shallow pool of freezing mountain water. The shock of the cold revived Elena instantly, a sharp gasp tearing from her lips as they emerged into a vast, echoing cavern beneath the mountain. The air here was clean, smelling of wet earth and moss. The distant roar of the fire above was muffled by feet of solid stone. Christian stood up in the knee-deep water, steadying Elena as she found her footing. The iron collar around her neck was still there, but the chain was gone. "Are you all right?" Christian asked, his hands moving over her face and shoulders, checking for injuries in the dim bioluminescent light of the cave moss. Elena looked at him, her gray eyes reflecting the soft green glow of the cavern. Despite the soot on her face, the tears and the bruises, a small radiant smile touched her lips. "I am alive, Christian. Because of you." Suddenly, a splash echoed from the darkness of the tunnel ahead. Christian pulled Elena behind him, his hand flying to his waist, but his sword had been left behind, jammed into the grating above. He stood defenseless, his fists clenched, ready to fight with his bare hands. If you are holding your breath to see who is waiting for them in the dark tunnels, please take a quick moment to leave a comment below. Do you think it's Ethan, or has Arthur found another way to cut them off? Make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the thrilling climax in the next part. From the shadows, a lantern light flickered, revealing the weary but relieved face of Captain Ethan Thorne, followed by 3 of his scouts. "Your Grace." Ethan breathed, stepping through the water to join them. "Thank the heavens. We heard your shout and ran for the lower defile. The whole foundry is gone, my lord. Arthur Vance is dead, buried beneath his own madness." Christian let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension finally leaving his shoulders as he looked at his loyal captain. "And the council? They are already assembling in the lower valley, my lord," Ethan said, his face hardening. "Lord Vance brought a detachment of the royal guard to arrest you for treason. He thinks you are dead or trapped in the mountains. He is preparing to claim the regency before the morning sun rises." Christian looked down at Elena, then back at Ethan. The old duke, the man who hid behind titles and armies, was gone, left behind in the ashes of the burning foundry. But the leader remained. A leader who now knew exactly what he was fighting for. "Let him assemble them," Christian said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that carried an absolute, undeniable authority. "We are going back to Oakhaven. It is time to show the council what happens when you try to tear down the anchor of the empire." The Grand Council chamber of Oakhaven was a cathedral of political malice. Heavy tapestries depicting ancient victories lined the towering stone walls, while a massive, circular mahogany table occupied the center of the room. Around it sat the highest nobles of the realm, their faces illuminated by the harsh, flickering light of a dozen iron chandeliers. At the head of the table stood Lord Malachi Vance, Clara's father and the mastermind of the political faction that had sought to destroy the Duke. He was dressed in robes of state, his face a mask of triumphant gravity as he slammed his signet ring onto a stack of legal parchments. Christian Sterling has abandoned his post, deployed the royal regiment without authorization, and fled into the northern mountains in pursuit of a common criminal. Lord Vance's voice boomed across the chamber, filled with a practiced, righteous indignation. "He has proven himself unfit to hold the office of High Chancellor. He is a traitor to the crown, and by the power vested in this council, I declare his titles forfeit and his estates seized by the state." "And who, pray tell, will validate that declaration, my lord?" The massive double oak doors of the chamber did not simply open. They were flung inward with such violent force that the iron hinges shrieked in protest. The council members gasped in unison, several of them leaping to their feet as a figure stepped through the threshold. It was Christian Sterling. He wore no velvet doublet, no gold chain of office, and no medals of state. He was clad in torn leather, his boots caked in mountain mud, his hands blistered, and his face smeared with the ash of the old foundry. Yet as he walked into the room, his chest heaving, his hazel eyes flashing with a terrifying, predatory intensity, he carried an aura of absolute majesty that made the entire room freeze in terror. He didn't look like a myth wrapped in silk anymore. He looked like a god of war who had dragged himself out of hell to claim his dues. Walking beside him, her hand held firmly in his, was Elena. Her head was held high, her gaze steady and unbroken as she looked upon the assembly of nobles who had treated her like a footnote in their grand game. Behind them stood Ethan Thorne and a full company of the 1st Regiment, their halberds glittering in the torchlight, sealing every exit. "Christian," Clara whispered from the gallery, her face draining of all color as she rose from her seat, her hands trembling against the velvet railing. "You're alive." Lord Vance stumbled back against his high-backed chair, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he looked at the Duke, then at the soldiers filling the doorway. This is an outrage. You are under arrest for treason, Sterling. Guard, arrest this man." The royal guards stationed inside the chamber drew their swords, but Captain Ethan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the panic like a trumpet. "Stand down, men. Your wages are paid by the High Chancellor, and your loyalty belongs to the true anchor of the Empire. Lower your blades or face execution for treason against the state." The royal guards looked at Christian, whose gaze was locked onto Lord Vance with a lethal focus. One by one, their swords clattered against the marble floor as they lowered their heads in submission. "Your conspiracy is at an end, Vance," Christian said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant rumble that filled every corner of the vast chamber. "Your kinsman, Arthur Vance, is dead. He died in the ruins of the old foundry after confessing to the entire plot. It was not a common criminal I pursued. It was an assassin sent by your faction to abduct the woman I love in an attempt to draw me into a trap." "Lies!" Lord Vance shrieked, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. "You have no proof. You have no standing here. You are a man stripped of your honor." "I have the ultimate proof," Elena said, her voice clear, steady, and filled with a brilliant intellectual defiance that silenced the remaining murmurs in the room. She stepped forward, tossing a heavy, soot-stained leather ledger onto the mahogany table. It was the private journal of Arthur Vance, which Ethan's scouts had recovered from the baggage train outside the foundry. "This ledger details every communication between Arthur Vance and your faction, my lord. It outlines the funds transferred from your private treasury to hire the mercenaries, and it names every noble in this room who signed their seal to the coup." The nobles around the table scrambled away from the ledger as if it were a live viper, their faces turning pale as they realized their doom was written in black and white. Christian stepped closer to Lord Vance, the sheer weight of his presence forcing the older lord to drop to his knees in terror. Christian looked down at him, his expression devoid of hatred. There was only a profound, immovable justice. "You thought my power came from these walls, Vance," Christian said softly, looking around the grand room before turning his eyes back to Elena. "You thought that by taking what I desired you could break me. But you only succeeded in freeing me from the cage I built for myself. I am the High Chancellor because I protect this empire, not because I own it." He turned to Ethan. "Take Lord Vance and his co-conspirators to the dungeons. They will face trial before the full tribunal at sunrise." As the soldiers dragged the screaming, weeping nobles from the chamber, a profound, breathless silence fell over the room. The remaining council members bowed their heads deeply as Christian passed them, their admiration no longer based on fear, but on a deep, reverent awe. If you are cheering for this absolute victory of justice and love over greed and betrayal, please take a quick moment to leave a beautiful comment below. Let me know your favorite moment of this climactic confrontation, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you can witness the emotional, heartwarming conclusion of Christian and Elena's journey in the final part. Christian did not look back at the empty seats of power. He turned to Elena, his hazel eyes softening into a look of pure, unadulterated devotion. He extended his hand to her, not as a ruler demanding a possession, but as a man offering his entire soul to the only person who had ever truly seen him. Elena smiled, her gray eyes shining with tears of joy, and placed her hand in his, their fingers intertwining perfectly as they walked out of the council chamber together, leaving the old world of shadows behind them forever. The spring breeze that rolled across the northern valley 6 months later was sweet, carrying the scent of blooming heather and wild lavender. The sun hung high and brilliant in an unclouded azure sky, casting a warm golden glow over the rolling green hills of Rosebriar. It was a landscape reborn, entirely cleansed of the dark shadows and cold mists that had once defined Christian's life. The grand manor of Rosebriar stood in the distance, its white stones gleaming like a beacon. But Christian was not inside its luxurious walls. He stood at the edge of a quiet, shimmering lake, dressed in a simple white linen shirt and dark trousers, his hair playfully tossed by the wind. The heavy gold chain of office and the midnight blue velvet doublets had been permanently retired to the state vaults in Oakhaven. He remained the High Chancellor, but he ruled now from a place of peace, traveling to the capital only when the king required the steady anchor of his wisdom. A soft rustle of grass behind him caused him to turn. A profound, breath-catching warmth spread through his chest as he watched Elena walk down the hill toward him. She wore a simple, elegant gown of soft cream linen, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders in loose waves, bound only by a single clean sage-green ribbon. The very same ribbon Christian had kept as a promise during his darkest hour, now meticulously washed and restored. Her gray eyes, once so guarded and distant when looking upon the legend of the Duke, now shone with a brilliant, radiating joy as they locked onto the man who stood before her. The architects just finished restoring the lower archives in the estate library, Elena said, her voice a sweet, familiar melody that instantly grounded him. She stepped into his space, her hands naturally finding their home against his chest. They found a collection of first-edition maps from the founding era. I think the High Chancellor might need to help me catalog them. Christian smiled, a genuine, deep-seated expression that had become a permanent fixture on his face over the past months. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him, closing the small distance between their hearts. The High Chancellor is officially off duty, Christian whispered against her lips, his breath warm and eager. He belongs entirely to the Grand Archivist today. And tomorrow. And for every day that follows. They shared a slow, tender kiss that spoke of a deep, earned peace, a silent vocabulary built from the ashes of betrayal, the terror of the Foundry, and the absolute vulnerability they had traded in the face of death. I still remember the day you offered me this entire estate, Elena murmured softly, resting her cheek against his shoulder as they looked out over the sparkling water. I was so angry with you. I thought you were trying to buy a cage for me just like the one you lived in. I was, Christian admitted honestly, his fingers gently tracing the line of her spine. I was terrified that if I didn't own you I would lose you. I didn't know how to love someone without trying to control them first. You had to teach me how to strip away the armor. And you learned beautifully, she replied, tilting her head up to look at him, her gray eyes reflecting the pure light of the afternoon sun. Look at you now. No velvet. No guards. Just Christian. Just yours, he corrected gently, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her forehead. From the crest of the hill, the faint, joyful sound of a horn echoed. Christian and Elena turned to see a familiar carriage pulling up the winding driveway of the manor. Captain Ethan Thorne stepped down, no longer clad in heavy battle armor, but wearing the crisp, polished uniform of the Grand Marshal of the Palace Guards. He caught sight of them by the lake and raised his hat with a wide, triumphant grin, shouting a warm greeting across the grass. The Empire was safe. The conspirators had been brought to absolute justice, and a new era of transparency and honor had begun in the court of Oakhaven. But as Christian looked from his loyal friend back to the magnificent woman holding his hand, he knew that his greatest victory would never be recorded in the state history books. He had started his journey as a myth, a man who had everything at his feet, envied by kingdoms, yet freezing to death inside a fortress of his own pride. He had fought a war not to conquer an empire, but to surrender his own heart. And in that surrender he had found an absolute, unbreakable freedom. Shall we go welcome our guest? Elena asked, her fingers intertwining perfectly with his as she took a step toward the hill. Christian looked down at their joined hands, a profound sense of fulfillment and peace settling deep into his soul. He had the world at his feet, but as he walked up the green slope beside the only woman he truly desired, he knew he finally possessed the only treasure worth keeping. Thank you all so much for journeying through this intense, emotional tale of power, betrayal, and true love with me tonight. If your heart is full after witnessing Christian and Elena's beautiful new beginning, please take a quick second to leave a comment below sharing your favorite part of their story. Did you love Christian's transformation, or was it Elena's quiet strength that stole your heart? If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and give this video a thumbs up. Your incredible support helps this channel grow and allows me to keep creating these long, deeply emotional narratives just for you. Until our next adventure, stay safe, be kind to one another, and I will see you in the next story.